Hey, welcome into the Husker247 Podcast. We finally have a few seconds here where we think we can have a conversation that won't be interrupted by breaking news from Nebraska. So let's just dive right into it. The Huskers lost one coordinator yesterday, locked up one coordinator yesterday, had several players enter the portal, and are 2 days away from signing their 2025 recruiting class. So Husker247 felt like we should get together, talk about all of it. So Michael Bruntz, Brian Christopherson, I'm Mike Schaefer. We're all here to talk about what's been going on with Nebraska on a very busy Monday. And gentlemen, I think we should start with Tony White. And we'll start with just a very easy, simple question. Are any of you surprised that here on December 3rd or post regular season, Tony White is not still with Nebraska's program? We'll start with Bruntz.
No, I mean, I was going back through our the little archives, and got down into the basement and was looking through the microfiche, and saw that on December 1st when he got the restructured deal last year. That was when everything went through, and it felt like at the time I was like, I remember thinking like, I don't think this is going to be a thing. Like, I don't think he's going to be here next year. So it always kind of felt like this was happening. I think for some people, and just going off of the conversations that happened after you posted the stuff on Sunday morning, Schaefer, was more about the surprise that it was a defensive coordinator position that he was leaving for, and less a head coaching job, which I think is what many people had assumed he would be leaving for. I think that's where the surprise was for a lot of people.
Is it as simple as there wasn't likely to be a head coaching job opening that Tony White both would have wanted and also been a strong candidate for? Could that be the simple reason as to why it's a D coordinator job and not a head coaching job? I mean, that ignores why is he leaving the defensive coordinator position, but just sort of identifying why it was not a head coaching position.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the jobs that are open now. I mean, Power 4 wise, I mean, Purdue. I mean, what jobs would make sense for him to be firmly in the mix for? And I don't know that there was a ton there. I mean, at least the jobs that were open on the West Coast, which, he has more connections there. Fresno State was open, which is kind of interesting because Garrett Classy, the former, well, I guess very briefly interim AD at Nebraska, is now the full AD at Fresno State. So there's at least that connection there. But there's not I don't think there was like a slam dunk job that like would make a lot of sense. Like, he's not going to like Charlotte, you know what I mean? So, yeah. I think that's part of it. I mean, it's a little bit of a calculated risk given kind of where things are at Florida State right now. But I mean, if he sees that as a stepping stone or a building block to where he can go in the future, I think that's a piece of it. With Nebraska, I mean, you kind of wonder, what was left for him to do there, or kind of what the dynamic was going into next season.
Yeah, I think that's fair. BC, what are your thoughts with Tony White?
Yeah, not surprised. I think it's a little bit of a heavy lift at Nebraska next year, and maybe there was some thought of that. He had sort of had a particular nucleus that he had worked with when you think of the names we talk about every week, your Ties and Nashes and all those guys, and they're not going to be here. So you're going to have to reset things a bit. I think Bruntz is right in the sense that like it's a little bit of a gamble because Norvell's on the hot seat, but in a way, not so much for Tony White, I don't think, because he's going to elevate that defense. They're just so bad. Like, he has to see it as like, okay, I'm going to at least make this go up 2 notches. Sort of like the situation where he came into Nebraska, where the bar is so low to the ground when he arrived that you can do nothing but raise it. And so even if like Florida State went 6-6 next year and Norvell's in trouble, Tony White could still raise his stock there. Obviously it's a place they feel they can recruit well, and they've got Malzahn coming in. And so there's probably a little bit of a feeling like, hey, this can all come together and get this team back to being elite in a hurry. And And I don't know if it mattered or not. I did think it was interesting when like Rule brought in Phil Snow, like with a few weeks left. The defense was, they'd had some outlier games where they definitely didn't perform like you hoped, like against Indiana in the first half against UCLA. But the defense was not in as sad a shape as the offense at that point. And so you always wonder how someone reacts to that when you got outside eyes on you, because you know how we would be if that were you had that like in your job. So did that play a factor? Maybe. And you also don't know the like internal dialogue, how certain coaches mix, and if there's anything there. I'm not suggesting there is, but there's all that stuff that people will speculate on that can always play a part in a guy making a decision like, yeah, I'd rather get out of here and start fresh somewhere else.
Yeah, and it's also, I mean, they were 2-10 in 2024, and they were undefeated and left outside of the college football playoff in 2023. Like it's not like there isn't a chance for Florida State to have an explosive or strong season in 2025, and for him to be a part of that and parlay that into another job. And quite possibly Tony White could have looked at it as maybe he feels like his defense plays better in the ACC than it might in the Big Ten, despite the fact that, it did well. And certainly he presided over a defense that allowed 5 total first downs in his final performance with Nebraska. And so it's not like it wasn't working in some situations in the Big Ten. But I just have a feeling that with what he wants to do and the style of the Big Ten, it was always going to be maybe a little bit more difficult. And he put 2 years into it. I think that he was really popular over there in terms of the players and people working with him. I know recruits liked him a lot. He's a really easy guy to talk to, as you guys are aware of. And I thought he handled himself really well. And I think he's a future head coach, and this might, elevate his stock a little bit more if he's part of a turnaround at Florida State. But it's certainly a gamble, because if it goes the other way, then he could be looking for a third job in 3 years if it doesn't go well for him with Mike Norvell, or if it doesn't go well with Florida State at all. So certainly something to kind of, keep an eye on from afar. The next question, I guess, sort of lines up, and we've had this conversation since he was hired in the summer. Do you guys feel like John Butler is a heavy favorite to be Nebraska's next defensive coordinator, given that he has coordinator aspirations? He likely joined Nebraska in the summer in part because there could have been this opportunity, just playing the string out, that if Tony White were to leave and you want to keep it internal, John Butler could be a natural fit there. Do you guys think he's a favorite for that job right now?
I mean, he's a strong candidate for basically what you laid out. I don't know. It's interesting. Like, was he brought in as like a coordinator in waiting? I don't know. I mean, I think if you're Matt Rule, you owe it to yourself and your program to really kind of give it a hard look around and see if things have changed in college football since the summer. My sense is they have. I think that Nebraska will be fine, because this is, the defensive side of the ball has always been fairly steady under Matt Rule. I mean, that's as much as they've struggled offensively at some places, the defense has always been fairly solid. So I feel like they'll make a decent hire there. But I don't know. I mean, the Nebraska kind of started moving some things around in the back end, this year with some of their coverages and scheme. I don't know that it was a good marriage of what they were wanting to do back there with maybe what Nebraska had done under Tony White in year one. But you're right. I mean, he had aspirations to be a coordinator, whether that was in the NFL or in college. I don't think that he would have come to Nebraska if that wasn't at least a possibility at that point. I mean, I think that's, would I say he's the front runner? I don't know. But I think he's definitely in that top group of guys right now. So, I guess that's kind of where I leave it. I mean, part of me thinks too, like, okay, if he's your guy, do you probably be able to announce that pretty quickly, right? Like that's not like not something that should take a while. So that's kind of why I think, you got to at least look around and do some due diligence on what's actually out there for your program.
You kind of hit the central thing to me, and I really like Tony White. I liked all my dealings with Tony White. I think he's an up-and-coming future head coach. But when it was apparent that this was going to happen, it's hard for me to get overly concerned about what Nebraska's defense is going to look like just because of Matt Rule's track record, and also partly because of where they play in the Big Ten. It's not like you're facing the most dynamic offenses, so you don't have to have – I don't know if you have to have a superstar defensive coordinator to have a pretty strong defense here at Nebraska, in part because Matt Rule's had a good defense everywhere he's been. He's a defensive coach. I think he's wired that way. I think he's good at finding assistants or setting things in motion for that. He found Tony White to begin with and brought Tony – I shouldn't say found him. He was the D coordinator at Syracuse, but brought him over. I think it's worth giving the benefit of the doubt that Nebraska's defense has every reason to continue to be solid to good as long as Matt Rule's the head coach. So I definitely agree with you on that, Bronx. BC, what are your general thoughts on what could happen here and potentially the idea of John Butler, or could we see a reunion of Phil Snow in this role as someone that Matt Rule has had before, or is there even a guy like Rob Dvorak who you could see elevated because he's done a great job, in his 2 years here at Nebraska?
Yeah, as you were talking, I think you also answered first off one of the reasons why Tony might have left too, if you were to put bullet points, and that's that even though his defenses did have success, you're always sort of attached to Matt Rule's defenses over his track record have done well. And is that because of the DC, or is it because Rule's just always had pretty good defenses? Because I remember the quote last December or whenever it was, late November, when Tony was up for some jobs. Rules said he'll do great if he stays here, and we'll do great basically if he leaves still. We'll still play really good defense. So Rule totally believes that. And Tony might have thought, I have to separate myself and prove myself in another spot too, where I fix another mess before I get that head coaching opportunity. I think Bruns is right on John Butler. Like if this were like Vegas odds, you know how those are. It doesn't mean necessarily that person is the front runner in someone's eyes, but he would have the best odds, I think, like on the table. But that doesn't mean to me that he's necessarily like, I don't know that he's Rule's favorite or not. Dvorak's interesting that you bring him up because I don't think a lot of people are. And Rule has always spoken glowingly about how he's a future head coach. He's just got the right temperament for stuff. And I don't think people should just gloss over him in the conversation. So I think you got to kick the tires on everything you can. Like you walk around the lot and see what's there. And whether Phil Snow would want to jump back into it, he's going to be 69 years old, I think, this month. And I'm not saying that he can't do it still. It's just a question of if he still wants to be part of that grind or if he's enjoying like the consultant work. Certainly he's had a lot of success with Rule, and he's watched Nebraska, I think, closely from afar, like what they're doing and maybe what would work and what wouldn't. So he's definitely a guy who, whether he is in the equation for the opening or not, I'd pick his brain, and I'm sure Rule will to a great degree.
The other kind of, before we get to Dana Holgorsen, we should at least acknowledge the conversation about Terence Knighton, that he might be joining Tony White over at Florida State. And we don't have to spend a ton of time on this because as of right now, we know of Terence Knighton still as Nebraska's defensive line coach, still involved with the team. But there's at least a possibility, or was reported there's a possibility, that he could be joining Tony White over there. Florida State still does have two defensive line coaches. But would you consider that to be a loss for this Nebraska program, just based on your experience here? We'll start with Brian, covering Terence Knighton these last 2 years and seeing what's happened for guys like Ty Robinson, Nash Hutmaker, and then kind of the maturation and growth of the Riley Van Poppels and Keona Davises and Cam Lenhart's under that tutelage.
Yeah, it'd be a loss, but nobody's irreplaceable. I mean, I think at this point too, like Jamari Butler's already said he's in the portal. I mean, if you're not going to really lose much more than you have that already lost, with as far as personnel, if that's like a worry about this thing, you've already, your seniors are gone. Butler's out the door, it seems like. So you can't really worry about that. I do think he's done a good job. I remember though, when he was hired, it was funny. Take us back 2 years. His was a name that surfaced and everybody thought he was coming in as like a assistant D-line, like a grad assistant, an
Assistant to
analyst.
the regional manager.
Yeah, that sort of thing. Remember that? That was like the
Yeah,
thought for like a few days. And then people are like, wait, he doesn't have all this experience. So he doesn't actually have a long track record coaching. So I thought, considering all that, he's done a very good job. His players love him. I think he's got a good room and sort of the camaraderie you need to go through the Big Ten grind. So yeah, I wouldn't downplay it if he left. And if he did leave for that position, it would tell you that Tony White obviously thought a lot of like what he was doing, and he would have a better opinion than anybody on it.
Yeah, well, and similar to the Matt Rule defense. I mean, Matt Rule's defensive line, pretty much everywhere he's been, every coach he's had has been pretty good. So it's one of those. I don't want to minimize the contributions because again, I really like Tony White. I've enjoyed Terence Knighton. I think Terence Knighton has a great personality. He's a good recruiter. He fits well in the college game. I wondered if he wouldn't ultimately end up as an NFL assistant, but I just have a belief that even if Terence Knighton goes, Matt Rule is going to be able to replace that with another defensive line coach that he's either worked with or is familiar with and is going to have success because, if you really dial into the Matt Rule success on defense, he's a former defensive line coach and his defensive lines have been great at Baylor, great at Temple, and they were the strength of the last 2 seasons for Nebraska on the defensive side of the ball.
Yeah, it's an interesting conversation with Knighton because, you just look at, obviously, he recruited well, was good at building relationships. I think what maybe got overlooked a little bit with him was, he was a really popular guy with not just the defensive linemen. I mean, offensive guys kind of glommed onto him. You ask, every player to a man over there who, was most important, and this is linebackers, jacks, with helping develop the pass rush and getting guys clicking there, and they pointed to him as being that guy, even if they weren't necessarily in the defensive line room. It's that group is pretty fascinating, anyways, and we'll obviously get into that with some of the transfer portal defections yesterday, but the defensive line is going to look a lot different next year, regardless of who's coaching that group and regardless of who's coaching the defense. And that's going to be a big talking point for the next, 9 months or 10 months until we get into the season next year. But, it would be a loss. And I think he was a guy too that, his profile was rising anyways in the college coaching ranks. And I don't know how much longer, he would have, Nebraska was able to keep him this year. It kind of felt like he was another guy that, would be kind of out and down the road pretty quickly here. So it would be a loss for sure. And I agree with you though, Mike. That's one area that Matt Rule's teams have typically excelled at is the defensive line play. So we'll see what happens. But like you said, as of this morning, early this morning, he was still Nebraska's defensive line coach. And that's, according to our own reporting and the guys down at our Florida State site too.
One area where Matt Rule would be the first to tell you his teams haven't always been the most successful would be on the offensive side of the ball. And I would submit to you guys, and I don't think there'd be a lot of disagreement, if Nebraska was only going to keep one of their 2 primary coordinators between the end of the season with Dana Holgorsen and Tony White, I do think it's almost more important for Nebraska that Dana Holgorsen has agreed to come back and is set in that role and is now taking over the offense. And we'll see sort of what changes come out of that. We'll see what the bowl game looks like and the offense there. But I think it was vitally important for Nebraska to keep that structure the same both for, what it can mean in terms of the success that Dana Holgorsen has had, but also the maturation and development of Dylan Raiola. I mean, if he's the guy here for the foreseeable future, you wanted someone who could help take advantage of his skill set, help develop him. And I think the retention of Dana Holgorsen is the most important news that came out of Monday. It's the one that I think was least surprising out of everything. But it would be hard for me to argue that anything else that happened on Monday was more important for Nebraska's future success than keeping Dana Holgorsen. How do you feel about that, Brunts?
Yeah, no, I would go along for that ride. I would yeah, I mean it feels like you're kind of whitewashing, what happened yesterday when you say that. But I mean, you talk about what Nebraska, the numbers weren't, earth shattering what they did the final 3 games, but I think Nebraska needs to see what this looks like long term with Dana Holgorsen. Like the run game looked better. It looked more efficient, and he was primarily doing that with Marcus Satterfield's playbook. Like we haven't even seen what Dana Holgorsen's actually going to do in Lincoln, and it needed to be kind of wrapped up because it's also a signal to your 5-star quarterback that, look, this is something that we take very seriously. We're making these changes. And you need some stability, quite frankly. I mean, I don't think that you would want to be walking into year 3 of your head coaching tenure having to replace both coordinators, with the way college football is now, having to cut your roster down to 105. I mean, it already feels like there's a great amount of instability just based on how yesterday went. And, it felt like, okay, like that's the one thing that you can kind of wrap your hands around right now is the offensive side of the ball has their CEO. And, he's going to have, I think, kind of a long runway to do what he's going to do with, coaching assignments and how they're going to do things. So, I think as much as, Tony White kind of got the run of the place, so to speak, on defense, I think, Dana Holgorsen's going to get that on offense. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I mean, it feels like a group on that side of the ball that really kind of needs to be shaken up for the better.
BC, what are your thoughts on the retention of Dana Holgorsen and what it might mean for Nebraska's offense in the future?
It was the biggest news of the day. It was a pretty strong counterpunch saved up. I think the email came out, at least hit my inbox at 7:11 p.m. And it was needed. It couldn't have waited much longer. Like it was one of those days where just all this bad stuff was festering and you could feel it. And they're up against the ropes and you needed to get that out there and say, we're moving forward with this. I think it makes December exciting as far as the bowl game to see what they do and like the personnel that's emphasized and all that stuff. I thought he did a really good job for 3 games. Like, and I know there's people, they always push back when I write stories about it on social media and stuff, like, well, he only scored this many points. I get it's about the points, but anybody who didn't see the difference in Nebraska's offense, to me, the last 3 games compared to just some of the stuff they did, the way they ran the ball, the O-line play suddenly looked better. And I don't think it was all just coincidence. Like the perimeter blocking got better. And this was while a guy was basically learning Italian, like he was speaking a different language. I mean, they did say they had to call a couple timeouts against Wisconsin because he couldn't quite spit out what their verbiage was because he was adjusting to it. So give him a full runway, see what it does. I also think the fact that he's been a 13-year head coach who had a 92-69 record, which is a lot better than a lot of head coaches have on their Wikipedia page. That's useful as you're trying to wade through those waters, I think, as a sounding board to Matt Rule, because this is a very tough situation they're in. It's a tough job. There's big expectations, and they got to take a big step next year. And the fact that Holgorsen is coming back, you're right, Schaefer, when you laid it out. If you put all the coordinators up and you said which one is coming back and which one's not, which causes the biggest ruckus, it would have been if Holgorsen weren't coming back. because we knew the defense is going to have to remodel a lot anyway. And so it almost just like kind of fits that they're going to remodel from the top down, to me. And, but yeah, the offense could not have that shakeup now, especially with the young quarterback that a lot of people would like to have in their program. So that was a big deal.
Worth noting, if you break the Nebraska's Big Ten season down into thirds, the third with Dana Holgorsen calling the offense, they scored the most points in that third. So even if it's moderate improvement, it's still improvement. Like it's still better than what you were doing previously. So, and the 44 points against Wisconsin is a big part of that, but that's also the most points they put up in any game this season. Like it still matters. It's still a data point.
It's fair for people to combat that with like, hey, you ended up only scoring 10 against Iowa. That's what it is. You did this and that, but you only scored 10. I get that. But just as far as like you break down the position groups and sort of what you saw from them, I just thought it was crisper. You felt more confident, didn't you, in the passing game that they could get something done. And, both coordinators, if we're going to be fair about it, were done in some big moments, plays where guys didn't make the play that was right in front of them. Like, the Nair drop against Iowa, you probably win that game. The missed throw to Lindenmeyer for Satterfield ended up being like a pivotal moment and sort of how that turned. So each coordinator sort of had that play that just escaped their grip that really would have flipped the narrative even more so.
Let's go to Michael Bruns for some breaking news that might also result in this podcast shortening in a relatively quick fashion.
According to our own Chris Hummer and Matt Zenitz, Nebraska set to hire Kentucky's Daniel Shorts as wide receivers coach. For those of you not familiar, long history with Dana Holgorsen. He coached wide receivers for him at Houston for 3 seasons. Also
played for him, right?
Played for him at West Virginia for a number of years and had moved on to Kentucky as the Wildcats wide receivers coach. I guess that was the long runway that I was hinting at briefly there. But, Daniel Shorts. That also, I guess, kind of brings into the question about Garrett McGuire and maybe what his role is going to be. Whether he sticks in the program in a different role, whether that means he's on his way out. So there's that news. And, frankly, you kind of had to get somebody in there quickly, I think, with that group, if only because you finally get these bowl practices. You've got a ton of young guys in that room. You're losing Banks and Nair at the end of this year. So, why not bring your guy in, start developing those guys and not waste any time. So there's that.
Well, that's exciting. We don't always get breaking news on this podcast, but I think we will in the first week of December going forward.
Was it Dylan? Was Dylan the other one that popped on this on the podcast?
I don't think so. I think we had quite a bit of prep for that one. I'm trying to think. I know that
the official announcement.
I still feel like we had stuff prepared for that, didn't we?
Yeah, but it was like the now kind of a thing.
Okay. No, it's you're right. The Shorts makes a ton of sense because I think if you're going to hire Dana Holgorsen, you need to let him have say in who his staff is going to be and who he's working with. I think Garrett McGuire will be repositioned. I mentioned it on the message board. I don't know if Nebraska will have an inside wide receivers coach and an outside wide receivers coach. That's something Dana Holgorsen has employed before. It's part of the Mike Leach coaching tree. It's actually how Dana Holgorsen he was an inside wide receivers coach at Texas Tech, as was Lincoln Riley, as was a number of coaches that are now flooding the college ranks. And so, I think there's ways that Nebraska can retain Garrett McGuire and utilize his recruiting. I mean, he's developed close relationships with a number of guys in this class. He helped Nebraska get Ja'Cory Barney. If they're able to pull off a flip with Cortez Mills, he's going to be a big part of it. If they retain and sign Jeremiah Jones, that's who Nebraska sent to Kentucky to help kind of lock that down. I mean, this is a guy that I think has a bright future in the coaching ranks. It hasn't, gone as well as hoped for him as Nebraska's wide receivers coach. But I think if there's value to be had there and he wants to stay in a refurbished role, whether that's sharing some of the wide receiver duties, whether that's as tight end, whether that's in the recruiting staff, I think you can get a lot of value still with Garrett McGuire. But that's certainly something to kind of watch, as we go forward. BC, what do you make of? I don't want to put you on the spot to just ask you about a hire of a guy that you probably only have read a snippet about, as the name has kind of been, discussed. But what do you think of just sort of the idea of Holgorsen getting the opportunity to put together his staff?
Yeah, he should. It should be who he wants. And you did good reporting on McGuire last night. Well, everything's fluid this time. Everybody understands that things can switch, but he was in the program still as of last night, and there could be a role for him.
He's there today. He's
exactly
working there today.
Exactly. This coach Shorts was a 30 for 30 guy, 30 under 30. We do a list on 24/7 Sports. So he was like one of those young assistants coming up that has impressed, and he's worked with Holgorsen before at Houston. And so, yeah, it makes sense to me. Obviously, they had some success with certain guys. Like you think of Tank Dell, who got mentioned at Houston, who's now in the NFL with the Texans and doing quite well. As a guy like Ja'Cory Barney was comparable in his traits to Holgorsen, made that known. And so this is a guy who worked with Tank Dell. And so I would think that would excite maybe Ja'Cory, who's a guy obviously you want to hang on to. And you're right. They had to get this done quickly because there's a lot of young guys there, and they need to know who their leader is here as you get into these bowl prep, and you got to hit the ground running in this first practice.
And it's,
no doubt about it.
I should correct myself. It's DeKel. DeKel Short.
Yeah.
Sorry. I'll hit some steps.
We were going to touch on some of the guys that have entered the transfer portal, and we briefly talked about both, I believe, Mekhi Bear and Jamari Butler there at the beginning. I think we're going to pivot. We'll go ahead and get this podcast closed, get this one up. Maybe we'll come back either later today or later this week as more guys enter the portal and can have a longer kind of wide-ranging discussion on that. But I anticipate we want to get a few things up on our website as news trickles in here with Nebraska's new wide receiver coach. Anything you guys want to add? Anything you want to finish with here as we kind of abruptly end this podcast here today on Tuesday as the news cycle has continued?
We've got a couple minutes to set the table for National Signing Day for us, which is tomorrow, which
is absurd.
Crazy to say, and it feels like Nebraska and Iowa played like 17 months ago. Like that's how long the game was ago.
You know what's valuable about hiring your wide receiver coach right now? Two of your biggest targets that you could potentially land on National Signing Day are wide receivers. And it seems important that they would know who is going to potentially coach them. Nebraska hoping to flip Cortez Mills, committed to Oklahoma. They've been working this one for a long time. They were on Cortez Mills before the Oklahoma commitment. They were on Cortez Mills after the Oklahoma commitment. He visited for the Colorado game. This is a guy that this staff really, really wants. He has been to Lincoln multiple times. He's got a close relationship with Garrett McGuire, but he's also close with multiple players on staff. He's close with guys that are committed to Nebraska. I know multiple Nebraska commits have been in his ear, over the last couple of weeks, just really kind of hammering home, hey, we want you here. Hey, we want you here. So Cortez Mills, keep an eye out for that. That could happen, at any point. I don't think there's a planned ceremony for Mills, so we'll keep an eye on that one. Michael Terry is going to decide at 8:15 a.m. on National Signing Day, so we'll have that one out of the way early. 5-star recruit out of San Antonio, a guy that Nebraska and Oregon, first two offers for him. Final three teams remaining, Nebraska, Oregon, and Texas. Nebraska has done a fantastic job recruiting him. Again, Garrett McGuire heavily involved, Matt Rule heavily involved. The Terry family kind of become friendly with the Raiolas. So there's a lot happening there. And there's a reason that he is held off from committing to Texas, despite that being the home state, despite that being a program that's in the college football playoff, despite the fact that Nebraska is, not quite where Texas is right now and hasn't been for a while. And yet they have an opportunity to potentially steal one. Crystal Ball says Texas. Every recruiting reporter that's covering this will tell you that they think it's Texas, and then they'll throw a but in there, and then their voice will trail off because Nebraska has really kind of maintained. And so we'll see if they're able to pull that off. Do we have additional breaking news that we need to put out here on the Husker 24/7 podcast before we say goodbye? Are we ever going to be able to sign off on this show, or will it just be a series of breaking news every 5 minutes? Stick with us and find out. BC, what do we got now?
Well, it's from Pete Thamel of ESPN. Daniel Kaelin plans to enter the portal.
Pete Thamel is like the personal Daniel Kaelin reporter, if I recall from last year. And that's where we were getting some of our updates, which is fascinating to me.
Yeah.
So Daniel Kaelin is planning to enter the portal. That's the latest news that we have, huh?
Yeah. So, I mean, you wondered if Daniel would stick it around for a few more years here, but obviously, there's sort of it feels like a QB1 in town for 25, and Husker fans would hope into 26. So, that was a tough situation. I think we kind of knew on signing day last year that would be interesting how that played out when there's only one football and obviously multiple guys who want it.
Thoughts, Bruns?
Yeah, it's interesting. I kind of wondered if that was going to be the move. I know he's a guy that Matt Rule thinks really highly of what his, potential future can be. It's a tough spot for him because, you are kind of blocked in by a quarterback in your own class. Heinrich Haarberg is still at Nebraska as the backup. So it's, there's only one ball, and if he thinks he's got to go somewhere else to play, then you kind of have to get that ball rolling early. I mean, what percentage of 4-star quarterbacks and Elite 11 quarterbacks end up transferring? I mean, it's more than 50%. So you got to go where you can play. I was curious to see if he would stick around in the spring and kind of see, get some film, a little bit more film, and kind of see what that looks like, but with the new offensive coordinator. But I guess he's going to explore his options. And he had a ton of options, the first time around with North Carolina, Missouri, where he was committed to, certainly Nebraska, Michigan State
popped up late.
Michigan State late. So he'll get some attention in the portal. I think he's got he'll have some opportunities out there.
Yeah, it's fascinating though, because Daniel Kaelin represents what confuses me about the transfer portal, because he has no film. He did not take a single snap in the 2024 season. His last film comes from the high school level. So is he transferring to go be a starting quarterback somewhere without taking a single rep? Like it's sometimes hard to parse through what the decision making is on this, because in my mind, he's probably Nebraska's backup quarterback for 2025 should he stay. You have Heinrich Haarberg there, but it wouldn't shock me if Heinrich Haarberg plays less quarterback in the future. It wouldn't shock me if Heinrich Haarberg had decided to enter the transfer portal, because unlike Daniel Kaelin, he has actually played. And so it fascinates me, because I don't know that there is a situation out there where someone's like, yeah, I'm going to take someone that doesn't have a redshirt year, that didn't play at all for a season, that has no film in the college level, and that guy I'm going to attach and bring in as a starting quarterback. He's going to go enter a competition somewhere else. And all the power in the world to him. But is he going to end up in a better situation than he's at right now, where he's one injury away from potentially being a quarterback? I don't know. Like that's what's fascinating. And there's dozens of now quarterbacks in the portal. And so that's all of your competition. And on Wednesday, everyone's going to sign a quarterback to their class. and that quarterback and you have the same amount of experience at the college level. I don't know. We'll see how it goes. I hope the best for him. I think Daniel Kaelin's a great kid. And I believe that he could be a pretty solid quarterback too. It's just, I'm fascinated by what the market is ultimately for someone with no snaps. That does he want to go be a starter somewhere, or does he just simply no longer want to be in Dylan Raiola's shadow? I think those are two different things.
Well, you wonder, and this is an interesting, this isn't necessarily connected to a decision with the 105, I don't think, for him, but with the 105 rosters, you're going to get some guys who go to the non-power conference teams, non-power fours. And those teams are going to get some good guys. Like, so I wonder if Kaelin will stay in a power conference or, maybe go just down a step, as we would see it, and see what he does, at that level and build yourself up that way. That's a possibility. So that's what I wonder as I see that news, if he might do that, but, we'll see how it plays out. Quarterback's an interesting spot with the you got to have 105, but you have to have like at least 3 guys you kind of like feel like okay about. So Nebraska's going to have to figure out some option that understands Ryle is the guy, that is willing to come in and be sort of a nice 2 or 3. And we'll see what happens with Harburg. I think a lot of people are curious to watch that one too.
Well, and then Harburg represents another fascinating point here, because he could be a backup quarterback or an emergency quarterback while you also use him in different roles. Like if you had to play him, you could do that, but he could also help you out, if you were to kind of be a gadget player in your offense for the future. So
he's like a great 105 guy.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was getting at.
Yeah.
Suddenly in this 105 world, you've got this utility player in Heinrich Harburg, who seems to have even more value now than even before. And so, Nebraska has TJ Lateef, who will sign on Wednesday. And if they keep Heinrich Harburg and he can kind of play in that dual role, you've got 3 guys right there. You have Jalen Gramstad. We'll see, what happens with him after his year of kind of sitting and learning and running scout team. So we'll see what Nebraska does. And then the other part of this whole conversation, does Dana Holgorsen have his eye on somebody that he would want to be a potential backup quarterback? And then Dylan Raiola holds the keys to all of this. He's right now at Nebraska. And I'm not trying to incite incidents of panic here, but is he still going to be at Nebraska when the portal closes? I think you have to make sure that answer is yes if you're the Huskers. So that has to be a paramount discussion and something that you get locked in here, as we move forward. Any other breaking news, or do I attempt to shut down the podcast again?
End it. Hurry, end it.
All right, guys, we're going to have, I'm sure, more podcasts this week with everything going on. We have National Signing Day again on Wednesday. We have the portal as it is happening. There's going to be coaching changes as it goes on. So be sure to check out everything we have going on at Husker247. Be sure to check out all the podcasts that we're going to have for you as well. So for Michael Bruns, Brian Christopherson, I'm Mike Schaefer. We're Husker247. We'll catch you next time.